Thank you for the introduction. Yes, as Mel mentioned, I'm Ross Cook. I'm a buildings archaeologist and dendrochronologist, so I'm quite lucky to spend my working life and personal life, to be honest, traveling all over the country, looking at old buildings to read or to record them, understand how they were built, survey them, draw them, photograph them, and also do tree ring dating to actually work out when the timber in them was felled for their use, for use in the buildings. And so the point of this evening's talk is histories in homes from the medieval to the modern, and it's really to have a look at the development of houses. How do we get from sort of the medieval hall house to the house and the houses we live in today, really? And is there anything left over from that medieval house where we live now? And so hopefully it will take you through a bit of an insightful evening to sort of hopefully understand with some nice examples as well of the buildings that we'll sort of be trying to understand. Um, and so buildings obviously vary quite greatly, especially our houses, and they vary from region to region, and they vary depending on how much money you've got to throw at them, the materials that they use, and the people that are living in them as well. Basically, the buildings that you can see here, they are mostly from Wales and some for a bit further afield, and they sort of demonstrate the sort of wider range of historic buildings that we deal with that aren't the bigger houses really, and all of these houses here are. I'd really say a lot of them are vernacular in their materials, but the style, obviously, even in the medieval period, straight away through to the modern period, they're sort of more of a national level of style that seems to float around with regional variations. And so we can see here from the nice little thatched cottage in the top right hand corner, to the Georgian in the centre, really, but the sort of vast array of forms that we get from sort of really around sort of, well, the earliest one here is 1333 up until 1800. And so we need to start at the beginning and the medieval hall house. So these are really the medieval period. What I'm considering here is from 1066 to 1550, and we don't have any domestic architecture that survives from a pre-Norman period in Britain. And so what is the medieval hall? So the medieval hall is it meets quite a strict criteria of sort of arrangement, really. And now large and small, they tend to be arranged as we see in the top left here, by four bays, which are usually separated into three what we call units by the bays. So you have the first one, which is usually the service, and now this is areas for storage and preparation of food, and sort of some of the general activities that would be would help maintain the daily life of the household, really. You then move into bays 2 and 3, where you have the cross passage, which in a medieval house it's quite ubiquitous, passes from one side to the other of the hall, and then obviously you have the hall, which is the main living area. These areas were often open, or well, in most medieval open halls, we'd hope they're open from the floor to the apex of the roof, and you have an open fire in the centre. Now, depending on the size of the house, some of the cooking may have been done within the hall. Other houses and other places where they had a bit more money had an external kitchen where food was cooked externally and then brought in. And this is where the general day-to-day living of the household took place. And I'm saying household, actually, and I should probably talk about that very briefly. And so the household wasn't just the people that lived there. It was anyone, or I should say the family that lived there. It was anyone that had an association with the house and the general day-to-day life and goings on with these places. Which also leads me on to say that all of the medieval houses that we have surviving today, none of them are peasant houses. They are all what we would consider middle class and upper class houses that survive, which is quite important when we're considering these. So they're big houses, and then so the household then associated with them would have been household staff. They may have been farming, they may be labourers, there'd be people that might be just stopping in. It's where everything happened, basically. And then you have the parlour. And the parlour was the sort of the private living room where the owner and their sort of more high status guests would have been invited to relax and also then sleep. And then you have your chamber, your bedroom over. And the bedrooms in a house like this were reserved for the family or special guests. And the chambers often were occupied by more than just the couple, the head of the households, basically. It would have been their children, often grandparents, and we know that these spaces must have had quite a few different people sleeping in them, because we all know about probably medieval truckle beds, where you pull something out from underneath something else, and there's quite a few medieval houses and chambers where we've seen grooves in the floor from generations of people pulling bedsteads. And so in these halls, like I said, lots of people would often end up living in and around these places. And so sleeping arrangements were quite loose. If you could find a space to lie down and sleep, you slept there, basically, whether it was on the floor or if you're fortunate to get a piece of furniture, that would be quite nice as well. In some of the larger houses, we know from contemporary records that they had chests kept in the hall or parlour that were basically for storing straw-filled sacks to make it a bit more comfortable for people who are going to be staying to sleep on. And we also have in the hall records of the sideboard and the cup board, in which was literally a board where you displayed your best wares to show people what you had. And within this space as well, within I think I mentioned already that these were a hierarchical space, and it's called the tripartite arrangement. Like I said earlier, and you have your high end, which is the parlour, and the low end, which is the service. And it's where we get sort of our high, middle, and low class from. So in the hall particularly, the head of the household would have sat at the dais end against the partition to the parlour. Then at the low end of the hall, where the cross passage was, near the cross passage, you would have had your lower status visitors sat whilst you're eating and doing your day-to-day activities. And then between the two, you had the middling sorts, and that's where we get that idea of high, middle, and low class. So you sat in there based, you sat in the hall based on where you sat in the social structure, really. And so we'll move on to a couple of examples. And now I said there'd be a couple that are going to be out of region, and this is one of them, Mill Farm in Maple, Durham. And I've used this example because I know the house well. I stay there quite regularly when I'm off doing dendrochronology in various different places. It's the home of a chap called Dan Miles, who taught me dendro, which is quite a good house for a dendrochronologist. And it's a medieval Cruck hall house built in 1335. And it's your classic sort of farming hall, basically. So these were owned by the sort of the at this point in time the manager, and they weren't freeholders. They farmed the land for a larger estate, but in themselves they were quite wealthy, and they would have held this land over a multi-generational period as well. And so these houses were large for their time, although today it seems a little small. And this is quite a nice example, because you can see in the picture in the middle at the bottom the smoke blackening of the timber, which is often the way that we identify whether or not something was medieval, because the open fire used to blacken the smoke and the thatch. And it's quite nice because this one, you can see, if you can see, there's a couple of pegs. Let me just get the pointer. You can see, oh, it's going to work. Oh, come on. There we go. So you can see these there. These are pegs which used to take a plate for what is called a smoke louver, which is what we've got here. And a smoke louver you don't find on every building, but a smoke louver was sort of like a proto chimney. It helped fire escape from the open fire below and just make the space a little bit clearer inside. And it survives quite remarkably intact, really, because it's had quite light touch from the estate. Though what you don't see from this photo is actually the Oxford Dendro Lab is in what we call the nuclear bunker. It's buried underground off to the left-hand side of this photo, so you can't see it at all. And it's where we do a lot of our dating work. And the next example is Killai in Llandelo Graban. And this is a later hall house of around 1500. And these two quite neatly show the variance you can get in that medieval hall. And now those smaller halls were being built right up until the end of the medieval period, and even slightly beyond as well. And actually, I should go back quickly, talking about the peasant sort of house and the scale, that we don't have any peasant houses surviving. They would have, from excavations done across the country, these peasant houses would easily fit within about that area of this property. So they were quite small. And then this, again, like I said, it's quite large. It's got cross wings at either end, at the high end and the low end. And it's like most halls, I say most halls, a lot of halls did have storied ends, but this has also been turned into a cross wing, so it's got the gables projecting to create quite a fine frontage originally, we see here. And often with some of these sort of larger houses or finer finished houses, we do get heated chambers and heated parlours at the end. In a lot of medieval houses, the chambers and the parlour were unheated. The only source of heat in the house was the hall. And so this is quite obvious in its display of, we've got a bit of cash because look, we're heating multiple stories, and look, we've got some nice big rooms upstairs. And the display of stone and timber, again, is quite a display of people's wealth and status, and yet still maintains that open medieval hall in the centre. But this one has a lateral chimney off to its rear, so it's quite, they're doing quite well for themselves. So these houses were ways of displaying your status really in society. And quite remarkably here on the dais partition, they have what you can see here, the painted screen survives. And the evidence suggests that this was actually pre-flooring. So before they floored over the hall, in the next period we'll look at, it was decorated in quite a rich display of colour. And during the medieval period, most places, most of these halls were painted in some way, whether it's quite a basic sort of pattern or motif, or more elaborate like this. If you really had money, you had tapestries, but tapestries were for the mega rich. Painting was for the everyday. And to give you an idea of how expensive tapestries are, in the great watching chamber at Hampton Court Palace, some of Henry VIII's tapestries, and they are woven with various gold and silver threads, but at the time they cost more to make than a battleship. So there's various different ways of displaying your wealth, and what we've got here is, it's not the low end, it's not the high end, but it's certainly quite nice. And you can see in the plan here, despite having the cross wings, it still maintains that cross passage, the hall, the parlour, and the service end as well. So then we're looking at flooring the medieval hall and the sub-medieval house. And so what do I mean by sub-medieval? I was asked this earlier by Mel, because it's not immediately obvious. Sub-medieval almost makes it sound like it's pre-medieval, but it's a term that was coined back in, I think it's something like the 50s, or maybe 40s or 50s. And what it means is it's the period immediately after the medieval period. So we're looking basically at the 16th century. And everyone has a different idea of when the medieval period ends, of course. And so around the late 15th century, we start entering a period of global cooling. Well, certainly in Europe anyway, we enter a period of cooling, which takes us right up until the Thames ceases to freeze in the 19th century. And people are seeking to heat their house more effectively, rather than just having the hall, but also how do you heat multiple rooms when you don't have any safe way of doing so. And so the chimney the chimney is often inserted into the hall. Now in this example here, we've got what they call a lobby entry, where you enter against the side of the chimney. And in some instances, chimneys were inserted before the floor was hauled, so there's a generational gap. Sometimes they are inserted and done, the chimney's inserted and the floor's done at the same time. And in a lot of cases it is then taken to heat multiple rooms. So in this example of the plan we've got down here, you've got the floored hall. At the service end, they also put a fireplace in, which provides somewhere for them to cook and use within the kitchen. And then, but we've still got the general plan maintained of the medieval period within the flooring of the hall. So you've still got the floored hall. You've got the hall, which then gets floored. It's still where the everyday business takes place, where you meet and receive most people. It's your semi-public space, and then you have your parlour, which is your private end, and the kitchen. And something I forgot to mention in the last period as well is that the idea of private space hadn't really quite developed in the medieval period, and even into this period as well. Most areas of the house were open to more than just the owners to be passing through and going into. And then we have what we call the sub-medieval house, which is really part of that same development. But these are the purpose-built houses of the 16th century. And the plan we've got at the top here, for those that have been there, is probably going to recognise my sketch plan of Llandovery Hall. And these houses often start to change the medieval plan, basically. And so they're sub-medieval because they still have a lot of influence from that medieval tripartite arrangement and that hierarchy. However, it begins to shift. So the medieval house, symmetry was based on the long axis of the house, and the hierarchy was based horizontally along that. In the sub-medieval houses, the purposely built one like we have here, this is a more gentry house. The hierarchy becomes vertical, and symmetry starts to move away from that horizontal along the ridge. They start to consider different different aspects, basically. And so often you see with these sub-medieval houses, there's still here, like we have here, you still have the floored hall, which is maintained. You have the nice big fireplace. The cross passage is still there, but the parlour has shifted from the high end down into a cross swing, and it's immediately on entry. So this is because the hall in these places is often, because they're gentry, they're usually people like JPs or sheriffs. The hall becomes a centre for justice, for collecting rents and dispensing other duties associated with their rank and status. And so anyone that you're receiving in that house, or your immediate household, or more close members of family and friends, could go in and be taken straight into a parlour. And then beyond that, you have the kitchen, and often in these places, the kitchen links with both the hall and the parlour. So the hall is a social space, it's a ceremonial space. There's still lots of food and feasting going on there, but it's much more of the everyday goings on within the house. And like I said, the hierarchy changes at this point, and the hierarchy is taken up. The higher you are within society, the more important guest you are. You get taken upstairs to the great chamber. So in the sub-medieval house, often you get a separate staircase, which we have here, which takes you to the first floor, and you get taken to the great chamber. And now the great chamber is it's essentially a dining room. It was where you dined and wined and dined even your favoured guests. They were obviously often more lavishly finished than the floored hall. So you tend to get with the floored hall lovely timber ceilings, quite heavily finished. But when you go upstairs, you've got a ceiling still with your timber, but often finished in nice plasterwork. And the plasterwork may detail your social status, your heritage, who your allegiance is to, along with basically any other symbols that might be associated with your family or your business. And then over the wing, you then had your private chamber over the parlour. And if you were a very, very special guest, you often got taken in there as well. And I suppose entertained is not necessarily the right word to use here. It might bring up different connotations, but you would be dined in there basically as private guests. And so the privacy within the house basically increases as you move through and move up. So this is Llandovery Hall, and it's an absolute corker of a house. And these houses often survive incredibly well because they are so big and because they are so well built. And these come at a period of great social and political change in Wales. And so in the 1530s, we were rocked by the Reformation and the crown taking monastic lands into his possession by Henry VIII. And we then have the Acts of Union of 1536 and 1542 between England and Wales. Now, the Reformation and the claiming of lands from the monasteries releases huge amounts of wealth, but also resources as well, and land that was previously managed by the monasteries. And the second brings in a new social political class, and often these people are plonked into new lands, minor estates or manors, and they become justice of the peace. They become sheriffs. They are not all the time, but they're quite often English families. And what they do is they establish themselves on new plots where there's not previously been a house, often on the flat and open spaces. So they are very much seen in the landscape. And they were very permanent because they were often, not all the time, but they were often either stone or half stone, half timber built, which required a lot of resource as well. Stone built houses, you need a lot of quarried stone, you need a lot of lime. They were about permanence as well. And so that's an outward display of your wealth there. And then as you move inside the building, you then hang timber off everything that you can. So you can see in the photo just in the bottom right there, the ceiling of the hall at Llandovery. And it is impressive, and they are huge chunks of timber. And the bigger the timber, the better grown the timber, the more you're saying, look at me, I'm doing quite well, aren't I? And then fireplaces. So within Llandovery Hall, you've got a great big fireplace in the hall. There's a nice large fireplace in the parlour. You've then got the kitchen fireplace, and then you've got fireplaces at first floor as well. And this is all part of that display of wealth. You can't stick a Ferrari on the drive, or a Tesla these days, I think it might be. But you demonstrate your wealth through both your house, but also your access to materials. So how much timber are you burning? Can you maintain those fires going? And it's what these houses are about, really. It's about setting out that new seat of sort of political and as well cultural sort of power over Wales. And Llandovery does survive particularly well because it was such a large house for its time, even by comparison to sort of the sort of say more everyday house. It's just massive. It's just a really big, fine house, really, and I get quite excited about it, but it's quite hard to put into words exactly. But these houses also, as I was meant to say as well, with the medieval house, you have your servants basically sleeping wherever they could fall, so in the hall, generally speaking. This is the first point in time where you start getting servant accommodation or householder accommodation. So up in the loft space, you don't see the trusses anymore, which you would have done within the medieval house. The roof space now becomes lodgings for people that work for you and within the household. People still generally sleep where they could fall, and actually there is an early record of, I can't remember what the name of the house is now, but in their parlour, they actually, on a probate record, there is actually a bed within the parlour. So it sort of gives you an idea that idea of privacy and space and where you might sleep or not sleep isn't quite as fixed as we'd have today. And the other example that I'm going to bring in is the Old Court in Kerry. This is quite a nice house because it's, if anyone knows sort of the area around Newtown quite well, you see a lot of these houses. And this one's quite a nice example because it's built around 1550. And if you can see from the timber framing here, It was built with quite low eaves, and it was a medieval, well, still a medieval hall, and probably with these two ends reversed. So you probably originally had your parlour this end and your service this end and your entry down here. Quite quickly, they inserted a fireplace to the low end of the hall, creating a lobby. And then latterly, in the 17th century, they then radically changed the building by building a two-story wing and then raising the height of the rest of the building. And it shows that these buildings were easily adaptable and updatable because of their timber framing. New timber framing could be easily jointed and added into. But they're also large enough generally, because they were houses, like I said, of that sort of middling class, to enable the reuse of the ground floor space. And this one's quite interesting because there's a cellar that was inserted below what was probably originally the parlour end. And then when they built the wing, everything flipped and switched over. And so you have a slightly funny arrangement within the building when you're looking at it from a sort of, when you're trying to work out how it all went together. So we move from the sort of the flooring of the hall in the sub-medieval house, and we get the Renaissance house and central planning. Now these are starting to become more recognisable as houses that we'd see, and we see quite regularly today. Now the entrance has moved far more centrally to the face of the building and the front of the building, and I'm just going to the front of the building, and not all the time, but often you enter in on the side of something such as a dairy, and then you turn into either the hall or you turn into the kitchen. And that's quite a radical move away from that tripartite arrangement, and it's the first real move away from any sort of any form of that medieval planning of hall service and parlour. And the sort of remnants of the medieval, or not the medieval, the sub-medieval house. So I should have mentioned, the smaller sub-medieval houses quite often had chimney stairs, and that's what carries on into this period. And the use of the house was quite similar still. The kitchen was often the best kitchen, so it was somewhere where you still entertained people, you still welcomed guests. The hall was a bit more of a parlour space, but still very much acted in the same manner. The hall is where the family met, it's where you did your business, it's where you sort of relaxed and had a beer in the evening, or wine if you were that way inclined. Still with quite large fireplaces, and they are really a transitional house, really, between the medieval or the sub-medieval and the later sort of, as I'll call it, modern in the second house. And they're quite intriguing because they come in different shapes and sizes. The smaller ones, as you can see on the right hand side here, these are sort of single unit houses, and they can be really, really tiny. And I've measured and surveyed in the past ones that have only been sort of, I think about 6 meters square. They're absolutely tiny little things on the inside. And yet they still try to maintain the use of a parlour and an outer room or a service room, much like the large ones. And they're still called century planned because quite often, sometimes they do have an entry in the gable, but often they do have this little doorway in the front still in that central location, but it enters directly into the hall. And now both these forms of houses, they have the chambers upstairs. You still access chambers, so often still passing through other chambers. And they vary between being able to see the trusses or having a ceiling and an extra story above. Now, the ones on the right-hand side, I said they can be really small. They can also be absolutely colossal as well. And there are some near Forest Coal Pit which would easily gobble up a decently sized 4-bedroom house, but yet still maintaining that exact sort of plan. And now with the centrally planned and the Renaissance house, this is the Vanna and Abbey Cumhir, and it's just such a incredible looking property, but also planned property. It's very advanced for the time it was built in. I think the written date we've got for it is about 1670 something, isn't it? I can't remember the exact date now. And it was planned, a true centrally planned house. But the intriguing thing with this one is it was supposed to be, I think, a hunting lodge or something is written for the family at the estate in Abbey Cumhir. And now the face we're looking at here is the main face that looks out across the hillside and the valley when you approach it. But actually the main entrance was on the opposite side of the house. So you entered at ground floor level if you were a guest and when you were going there and you were entertaining, and you had your dining parlour and then you had your hall on that level. And these were rooms, again, very much for entertaining, for feasting, for having a good time with your friends and family, whilst you were being served by your servants. And in this instance, if you go down to the basement level, you have a kitchen and a service room, and off that you have a servants' hall as well, which is quite a significant provision for this time, because what it's doing is it's starting to separate the spaces of the house between those who live there and between those who are entertaining and those who are serving. And now when you go above the hall and the dining parlour, you have your chambers, and these were again for the family and the guests, and they would have been mixed rooms still, so you wouldn't have necessarily just had rooms just for the owners and just for the guests. They would have been relatively mixed still. And then above that you have your loft space, and the loft space really was servants' quarters. So this is the first point in time where we're starting to see with these houses where you're getting that real separation between the owners and their guests and those that are serving them, the wider household. And then we've got Town Farm in Grosmont. This is a really lovely property. It's got the date of 1673 over the door, and I can tell you it is 1673 because I dendro dated it. This is it was built by, I can't remember the name of the chap now, but he was a solicitor off working in London and also maintained a farm back in Grosmont. So you enter into your lobby essentially, which is this area here, which when it was first built did not have a stair in it. You entered into your lobby, and then you had your hall to the right hand side, and you had your best kitchen to the left hand side, and you still have your stairs at your chimney ends to access the first floor, and then upstairs above those two inner rooms you do have two smaller chambers as well, which are only accessed through the larger chambers. There's no hallways or anything yet, and so I think it's to try and emphasize the fact, I think, with these really is that we are getting towards this modern period. They are looking recognisably modern. You've got your central entry into what would later become an area of hallway where you have your staircases, but you're still looking on a relatively sort of sub-medieval plan in many ways. So this is where I say becoming modern, and I call it becoming modern because these houses of sort of around 1700 and later, they've taken a form that we recognise today and were built right up into the 20th century. And these are your double-fronted sort of farmhouses and cottages of popular memory, really. And so with the smaller ones, they're often just a small hallway, a parlour and a kitchen, and then upstairs that's reflected by two bedrooms. But in your hallway you have your stair, which provides access. In the larger houses, where you start getting your double pile houses, you get the parlour, a day room, kitchen and pantry, your hallway, but you have your staircase to access first floor, usually to 4 bedrooms and often a small nursery, sometimes just 4 bedrooms. And the only real thing that has changed from this period to today in that domestic planning, and particularly within these houses, is the insertion of a bathroom. And so this is why I generally consider myself most houses before about 1750 really as old. Anything before 1750, anything afterwards I see as quite modern, because we recognise them and we're still building them. These were also the first kind of properties that sort of started to lose their real vernacular nature, their vernacular materials, because by the end of the 18th century, we start seeing the importation of pine from, we have it from North America, from the Baltic in the 18th century. But by 1800, we're starting to see quite a lot of North American imports. And this radically changes the materials and the sizes of buildings because of the availability and the abundance of cheap materials. And so Cymrachen in St. Harmon is a nice example of this sort of double-fronted farmhouse, really, but still retaining some of its sort of earlier sort of vernacular form. And it was originally half timber, half stone. And you enter in, as you see here, in the plan, you enter into the hallway with your staircase. You've got your parlour, your kitchen, your back kitchen or scullery, and your dairy. These houses are often they often survive intact because they are, they're really quite advanced plans, because they provide all the suitable space required, really, for everyday living, with entertainment and relaxing space, and then obviously food storage and preparation. And it's with these houses now that we get that final separation between public and private space. So with the medieval, the sub-medieval, and the Renaissance house, there's a very free movement between floors, because each different area has an idea of entertainment space behind it, and also exclusivity. So the closer you are to the family, the further into the household you get taken. Whereas by the time we get to this point, it's family and upstairs only, and if you have guests staying, they have a space. If people are just visiting on a day-to-day basis, and they're not going to be staying, there's no need for anyone to move anywhere else within the house. And these houses will still maintain some of that vernacular style. So the medieval houses, you saw the painted partition, that plank and muntin partition. These houses still maintain certain elements of that vernacular styling, but by and large it's starting to give way by this point to lath and plaster. And I can't finish without looking at the Welsh cottage. The Welsh cottage, now I said through the talk, these are buildings of the middle classes, really, and in the sort of the yeomanry farmers and the lesser gentry that we've really looked at. Now, the Welsh cottage is what most people in Wales were living in from the 17th century onwards, and they emerge out of the sort of the peasant hovel, as we'd call it. And they, in the early period, they kind of mimic the medieval hall. They've got a large open kitchen hall space, and then usually and often a small parlour associated as well. And then as we sort of move through into the 18th and 19th century, they start becoming double fronted, but only single story. And they may look on the outside, quite proper, but when you get inside, you find within the kitchen's off in the earlier ones has a smoke hood, so it's a wattle work woven and clay covered hood over an open fire, and then you have your pantry, a small corridor, hall, and then you have the parlour. There were no chambers or bedrooms, and in these places you did sleep where you could fall. There's a record of one just outside Llyndaw Brefi in Ceredigion, where there in houses this size there were 16 members of the family living and sleeping at once. They come in generally two different plans, as you can probably see here. You've got your central entry, and then you've got your direct entry into the kitchen on the right hand side, and they both serve exactly the same functions, really. There's little to distinguish between the two, apart from where you enter. And now the earliest that we tend to get are these often late 17th century. So this is a place called Park in Castle Martin in Pembrokeshire, and it's quite an incredible and remarkable survivor. Just simply because no one ever had money to put into it post sort of about 1880, and so it retains some of its early trusses, and quite wonderfully as well, its original under thatch for the thatch work. So it's twisted straw rope which they've used to tie the base layer of the thatch on here. And then repeated coats over the top of it until they eventually slung tin sheets and then tarpaulins over the top. And it's quite enigmatic. It's now been fully restored, and it's now a family home again, which is quite nice. And they really serve the function for sort of homestead farmers. So lots of these were dotted across the landscape to sort of support the larger estates and the larger farms to work the land. And then Pont Bryn Medr in Llancheiron, which was in quite a sorry state a number of years ago and has now been done up by the National Trust. And these places were often built, as you can probably just make out here. There's bits of stone, but a lot of it is clom, which is an earthy clay mixture slapped on top of each other until you get a wall high enough, usually with straw in there just to help keep it together, and maybe some wooden pegs. But once they were finished, they were coated in a lime wash just to weatherproof them and keep the rain out. And they do, when they're maintained, they survive incredibly well. And that's the end.